In these moments, we see not a queen but a woman terrified. On March 1603, Elizabeth Tudor died. She'd ruled England for 44 years, longer than any monarch before her, king or queen, male or female. She was only 25 when she inherited a kingdom on the brink. Now she leaves it to her cousin, James VI of Scotland. The Virgin Queen is succeeded by a king. England changes, hurtling towards civil war and then revolution, from which no British monarch will recover. Elizabeth is dead, but her story isn't over. There's so much more to tell you about her ghost. As courtiers began arriving in force to pay their respects to the deceased monarch, it was clear something was wrong. Elizabeth wasn't in her coffin, yet her body had already begun to fail. Soon after she died, servants entered her room to find her corpse lying face down on the floor. Someone had dressed her in layers of silk and velvet, adorned her with jewels, then laid her out on her bed like a bride for her final journey. Then, of course, someone had moved her to the floor. The question was why? Was it an assassin who struck? The queen was known to have enemies, even in death. Or was this natural? Perhaps in her final days, the queen had struggled to get up. One theory holds that she collapsed after rising to use a chamber pot. Another says she fell during one of her frantic prayer sessions. Either way, her dress was torn, her body bruised. The coronation of James VI followed swiftly. The new king took the throne less than a month after his cousin died. But Elizabeth's body remained in the Tower of London, a royal prison, where many of her ancestors had met their end, including 2 of her mother's lovers. After 8 days, the body of the late queen was taken to Westminster Hall for public viewing. Crowds gathered, eager to catch one last glimpse of Gloriana. They were horrified by what they saw. Elizabeth was grotesquely swollen, her features distorted, her limbs discolored. Clearly, she hadn't died of natural causes. Rumors flew. Poison. Assassination. Hadn't the queen been the victim of foul play? Some said her favorite, the Earl of Essex, had poisoned her to avenge his executed brother, who died fighting against the Spanish Armada, a disaster of Elizabeth's making. Others blamed Sir Walter Raleigh, whose own brother had perished in that same battle. Any one of her favorites could have slain her, they whispered. There was no love lost between them. Or was there? Perhaps the queen's enemies had poisoned her. After all, Elizabeth had made powerful foes. During her reign, she'd tangled with Spain, France, the Holy Roman Empire, not to mention the Pope. Whoever had killed her, they were doing their best to make sure she didn't rest. But finally, after 3 weeks, the queen's body was placed in a lead coffin, then sealed in a stone tomb at Westminster Abbey. A century after the opening of her tomb, Elizabeth's remains would be exhumed and examined by scientists. They found that she'd been around 5 feet 5 inches tall, a bit shorter than average for the time, but most surprisingly, her skull showed no signs of trauma. Whatever killed her did so without leaving a mark. The evidence today suggests she died of natural causes. But that doesn't explain the confusion, the wild stare, the confessions. Apologies and commands she whispered in the dark, nor does it explain why her body was so badly treated, tossed onto the floor, stripped of dignity and death like a queen, like a woman. For centuries, the legend of Elizabeth I has endured. The Virgin Queen, the Lioness, the unparalleled monarch who brought England to the height of its power. Yet here we see, not a goddess, but a mortal woman, racked with fear, gripped by the past, unable to escape the ghosts that swarmed her final days. As Elizabeth Tudor lay dying, the world she built and left behind began to crumble. And in those closing moments, she had no way to stop it. Neither do we. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other content for more tales of the past. And remember, if you subscribe, we'll bring you new stories each week. See you next time. For Elizabeth, death was a trespass, an invasion of the realm she had ruled for so long. Her court had learned to fear silence, but now it was all that remained. Ministers crept like shadows through the halls, careful not to disturb the thick stillness that surrounded her. No one knew what to say anymore, and even those who had once basked in the warmth of her favor now spoke in hushed tones, not from respect, but out of deep, shivering unease. The queen was no longer a ruler of presence and command. She was becoming a relic of something once divine, now decaying. Her long refusal to name a successor bred more tension with each passing hour. Her counselors, Cecil, Howard, and others, were torn between duty and fear, between preserving the dignity of their queen and preparing for the inevitable collapse of her reign. Yet still, Elizabeth refused to lie down. For 6 full days and nights she stood, her thin legs trembling beneath layers of velvet and bone, refusing the bed that seemed to beckon her like a grave. Her ladies-in-waiting tried to persuade her, even begged her, tears in their eyes, voices trembling, but she pushed them away with a stare that pierced like frost. "Must is not a word to be used to princes," she once said in her youth, and now in the hour of death. She lived by it more fiercely than ever. But her body, the once commanding vessel of a nation's power, could not obey her will forever. Her feet swelled, her fingers shook. Her heart beat with irregular rhythm, too slow one moment, too fast the next. Her lips cracked beneath the weight of white lead, and beneath her eyes bloomed the deep purple shadows of insomnia and despair. Still she stood, till she couldn't. Her knees gave way beneath her, and she collapsed silently into the arms of a servant. No scream, no cry, just surrender. They carried her, finally, to the bed she had refused. Laying her down upon stiff royal sheets as though placing a relic inside a coffin, her eyes remained open, but they did not see. Her mouth parted slightly, but no words came. It was as if her soul hovered at the edge of her body, not willing to leave yet, not certain what waited beyond. Outside, the court trembled. England had known only her for 44 years. Entire generations had never known another ruler. To imagine a world without Elizabeth was to imagine the end of order itself. Some believed her death would spark civil war, that rivals for the throne would rise and tear the country apart. Others whispered that her death was a punishment, final reckoning for the blood spilled during her long and turbulent reign. In corners of the palace, priests murmured prayers over candles that sputtered and dimmed in the March winds. And still the queen lingered. They said she refused all food and drink, that her throat was parched, her stomach empty, yet she pushed away every offering with a twitch of her hand or a shake of her fading head. Physicians tried poultices, concoctions, even ancient remedies involving crushed pearls and rose oil, but nothing touched her decline. Her mind was no longer in the room. She had drifted somewhere between worlds. Some nights she moaned softly, words lost in breath, syllables warped beyond meaning. One lady swore she heard her whisper, "I am the shadow I feared," though no one else confirmed it. Another claimed she spoke Latin in a fevered trance, cursing and absolving her soul in the same breath. But whether these were truth or tales, one fact remained certain. One fact remained certainly. She was struggling as if dragged into death by unseen hands. And around her, those same shadows she once commanded began to consume the palace. Curtains were drawn tighter. Candles burned lower. The courtiers dressed in darker clothes, preparing not only for mourning, but for power shifts that would follow her last breath. Every footstep was muffled. Every look held suspicion. Messengers traveled in secret to Scotland, where James waited for confirmation of the inevitable. But none could bring themselves to speak it aloud in the palace. Elizabeth was dying. And in her dying, a chapter of English history was collapsing. On the 6th night, as her breathing grew shallower, her ladies brought in her old ring, a symbol of her queenship, of her promise to remain married to her people alone. They slipped it onto her thin, bony finger. Nearly fell off. The once glorious ring that gleamed in the sunlit courts of her prime now looked absurd against the corpse-like pallor of her hand. She did not react. Her eyes, sunken deep beneath waxy skin, flickered once toward the ceiling and then shut. A hush fell across the room. No one knew if she had gone. Then her chest rose again, slow, painful, forced. Not yet. Outside her chamber, the guards shifted uneasily. The wind screamed through the gaps in the stonework. Somewhere deep in the palace, a tapestry fell from the wall. An omen? A coincidence? None dared guess. The courtiers awaited the signal that had not yet come, the moment history would turn its page. And Elizabeth, England's longest reigning monarch, hovered between life and legend. Welcome to my channel. Today we're looking at the death of Queen Elizabeth I, one of Britain's most iconic monarchs. It's me. And if you enjoy this video, please remember to support us. The sun rose on Richmond Palace on March 1603, but no one opened the windows. Light was not welcome in those corridors where death hovered like incense. Elizabeth lay still in her bed, her frame barely making an impression in the pillows and bedclothes that moments before had cradled the most powerful woman in Europe. Yet, as her courtiers and physicians drew close to confirm what they already suspected, they were met not with finality, but with persistence. She was still breathing, faint, staggered, but still. The queen clung to life like a ghost refusing to pass. For hours, her chest rose and fell, each breath slower, each interval more dreadful. The silence was no longer respectful. It was unbearable. There was no dignity now, no majesty, just waiting for the inevitable. But death, it seemed, had its own patience. Elizabeth, even in her final ruin, would not surrender quickly. This, too, was a kind of power, a defiance not in sword or decree, but in sheer endurance. She had ruled for 44 years, outlasted countless enemies, and built an empire on her name alone. If death thought it could take her easily, it was mistaken. Yet this was no victory. There was nothing glorious in it, only horror. Her attendants whispered prayers through their teeth, while others whispered speculation. Was this agony her punishment, her purgatory for the blood on her hands? The lives she had ordered extinguished? Or was this merely the consequence of a soul that had burned so brightly for so long it could not find its way to darkness? By the evening of the 7th day, her hands had curled into claws. Her skin, once powdered and perfumed for courtly charm, was yellowed, brittle, almost translucent. Her jaw hung open. And yet her eyes refused to close. A bishop attempted to speak to her, leaning close, murmuring rites and scripture. She did not react. But when he asked if she died in the faith of Christ, they swore she moved her lips. No sound, just movement. A nod, a farewell, the signal the court had waited for. Still no one dared move, till finally the breath stopped. For real. The room held still for a heartbeat longer, then another, then too many. She did not inhale again. And then the realization passed like frost through every person present. The queen was dead. Elizabeth Tudor, monarch, warrior, icon, was no more. And yet no one moved. It was not triumph, not grief, it was paralysis, as though the death of one woman had pulled the very gravity out of the room. But history has no time for mourning. Within minutes the machine turned. The death was confirmed privately among her closest counselors, and even before the body cooled. A messenger was already on horseback, galloping toward Scotland. James would be king now. The Virgin Queen had died, and in her place would rise a man born of a beheaded woman. The irony was bitter, but the transition needed to appear seamless. Elizabeth had never named James in public, but she had nodded, they claimed. That was enough. It had to be. For if not, all hell might follow. Still, the body had to be treated. They worked in silence, as though she might wake again and punish them. But she would not. The breath was truly gone. And yet, even in death, she retained a kind of power, her figure lying in state. Watched day and night by guards who avoided her gaze. As word of her death spread, England itself seemed to hold its breath. Bells tolled, but not with triumph. More like warnings. Across the countryside, people wept, not just for a monarch, but for the end of something larger than a life, an era, a symbol. Queen who, despite all, had held a nation together through fire and blood, and now she was dust. Rumors blossomed like mold. Some said she died cursing the world. Others that she welcomed death with a lover's sigh. A few claimed her ghost remained in Richmond, forever pacing the cold floors, reliving her final sleepless nights. No one agreed, no one ever would. Because the truth of a monarch's death is never one truth. It fractures, multiplies, festers. The funeral, when it came, was no ordinary ritual. It was a pageant of mourning. Black drapery hung from every visible stone, priests dressed in solemn vestments. Nobles rode in silence, their eyes cast down, not from sorrow, but fear. Because Elizabeth had ruled with such force that even in death she haunted them. Every decision they made now would be judged against her legacy. Every whisper would echo her silence. And as her body was taken from Richmond to Westminster, the streets lined with peasants. All standing in dead quiet, they saw not a corpse, but a memory of strength, of severity. something they did not fully understand but knew they had lost. Her coffin was covered in purple velvet, the royal standard draped across it, and a wax effigy of her crowned figure placed atop. Soldiers marched. Choirs sang. But the music could not dispel the chill, because beneath the finery lay a woman who had died alone, whispering to ghosts, refusing comfort. That image would not leave them. It would outlast every hymn, every salute. And in the hearts of those who remembered her, the tale of her final days would become more than legend, it would become a question. What does power give you when death comes? What legacy do you leave when the throne is empty and the world you ruled moves on? And what they feared most was this, that no one, not even Gloriana, escaped the dark. If you enjoyed this video, please support us. Elizabeth's body had been moved from the palace to Westminster Hall, where it would lie in state until the funeral. As always, the logistics were precise, choreographed, down to the placement of every velvet cushion and the lighting of every taper. But there was little in Elizabeth's life or death that had been left to chance. But these final days were different. Rituals couldn't quite contain the terror that seeped through the palace walls. Her ladies-in-waiting stood rigid and silent beside her coffin, their faces pale masks, eyes downcast. They had watched the queen fade, become a shell, then wither. Now, they were keeping watch over something dead. Could not touch, could not speak to their queen, not now. So they stood guard in silence, 7 women bound by duty and dread, and the people, kept away from the hall by velvet ropes and armed guards, pressed close, straining to glimpse the woman inside the coffin. Their breaths hitched as they neared the threshold, as if entering a sacred space. And in that hushed reverence they glimpsed not a queen, but a mortal. Then horror lent shape to whispers. The queen's body had turned cold, days before the court admitted it. Her soul had hovered over the Thames, unwilling to cross, clinging to the dying embers of power. Others claimed that her face had hardened into something unnatural, her famed beauty. Her mask of lead and rouge cracking into a grotesque grimace, as if her body had refused peace, even in its final stillness. Yet these stories, morbid as they were, served a deeper purpose. They helped the people understand how someone so mighty, so revered, could fall into the arms of death, just like anyone else. And in that understanding they found something even more terrifying, that no crown, no icon, no divine right could protect you from the slow rot of the end. But Elizabeth's final performance wasn't quite over. As her body lay in state, the court was transformed into a theater of ritual and choreography. Mourning became a spectacle, measured tears, scripted lamentations, coordinated processions. The wax effigy they created of her, poised and regal, bore little resemblance to the ravaged figure that had wasted away in the weeks before. It wasn't just a tribute, it was propaganda, a necessary illusion to preserve the myth of Elizabeth the Eternal, even as her real form had crumbled into mortality. The effigy smiled with sculpted calm, while the corpse beneath the velvet rotted slowly in its royal casing. But the people didn't see the decay. They saw the pageantry, and they believed, because they needed to. As the body was moved through the streets toward Westminster, something strange happened. The people who had feared her, obeyed her, sometimes even hated her, wept. Some fell to their knees. Others threw flowers into the path of the funeral train. They weren't mourning a monarch, they were mourning certainty. For most of them, she had simply always been there. She had outlived popes, kings, revolutions. She had faced down assassins, plotted the deaths of traitors, and raised a crumbling kingdom into a European power. To imagine a world without her was to imagine a world without foundation. And beneath that grief lurked a deeper terror. What comes next? James VI of Scotland had already been declared her successor. He would become James I of England. And though the transition was peaceful in appearance, it carried the quiet tremor of a fault line. Elizabeth's courtiers, so long accustomed to her moods and methods, were now forced to reckon with a new ruler, new politics, new fears. Some adjusted. Others were cast aside. And yet none of them could forget the final weeks of Elizabeth's life, nor the dread that had soaked the palace walls. Even those loyal to James understood that they were walking across the bones of an empire forged by her will alone. The funeral rites continued, each movement designed to underscore the weight of Elizabeth's passing. Her coffin lowered into the tomb, the heavy lid placed upon it, sealed with wax, then stone. And over the course of many hours, Westminster Abbey slowly emptied. But outside, the crowd lingered, reluctant to disperse, unable to look away from the abbey, as if hoping to catch another glimpse of their fading monarch. Finally, as the sky grew dark and the crowds thinner, they began to drift away, taking with them the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions. What had caused her sudden illness? Why had she refused to name a successor? How had she endured those final weeks? And above all, who would take her place? Elizabeth's death had been swift and sudden, but her legacy lingered. Woven into the very fabric of London, inescapable, unavoidable. Even in death, she was everywhere and nowhere. Her face leered from shop signs and taverns. Her image was stenciled onto broadsides and ballads. Her words, spoken and unspoken, reverberated through the halls of power. And in the heart of it all, in the seat of her power, sat the crown jewels, heavy, cold, and very real. The Virgin Queen was dead, but her legend was only beginning. The stone that sealed Elizabeth's tomb was thick and heavy and final, but it couldn't smother the myths that had already begun to bloom in the silence she left behind. Even as the echoes of her funeral still hung in the vaulted ceilings of Westminster Abbey, her memory twisted itself into something far larger and far more terrifying than the woman who had once ruled. The world no longer saw her as merely a monarch. They saw her as a specter, a warning, a tragic emblem of power's final cost. In the months that followed her death, tales of her ghost wandering the halls of Richmond and Whitehall spread like rot through the court. Servants swore they heard her heels clicking against the flagstones long after nightfall, echoing in corridors no one dared enter alone. Some claimed she was searching for Essex, forever calling his name. Others said she simply paced, sleepless as ever, unable to rest even in death. James I, her successor, dismissed the stories in public, but he could not fully dispel the shadow she cast over his new reign. He inherited the throne, yes, but not the aura, not the fear, not the grip Elizabeth had held over her people. Every decision he made was silently compared to what Elizabeth would have done. Her policies, her resolve, even her cruelty became standards against which he was judged. In life, she had dominated her court. In death, she dominated memory. And that was perhaps her most unsettling legacy. The way she had transformed herself into an idea, something eternal, even as her body withered into dust. But those closest to her, those who had watched her final descent into madness and silence, knew the truth behind the legend. They remembered the trembling hands, the glassy eyes, the way her voice faltered and faded. They remembered the fear in her attendants' eyes as they begged her to sleep. The way she refused, not out of pride, but terror. The queen who defeated the Spanish Armada, the sovereign who presided over Shakespeare, Raleigh, and Drake, the ruler who never married, never bowed, never gave in. The contradiction was jarring, and it made her more mythical still. She had been a woman who ruled like a man, but died with the frailty of every broken human heart. In that paradox, the public found something hauntingly beautiful and terrifying, because it meant that even the greatest among them were not spared the slow, humiliating crawl toward death. Years later, poets would immortalize her with flourishes of grandeur, painting her as a goddess in human form. Portraits commissioned posthumously depicted her with impossible youth, ageless skin, eyes filled with knowing fire. But beneath each stroke of paint was a desperate attempt to forget the truth, to erase the memory of her body collapsing inward, her eyes empty and searching, her refusal to eat, her skeletal fingers twitching under layers of silk, her lips stained with lead. Her final words, if they were ever truly spoken, drowned in speculation and embellished with meaning. But the truth, as always, was darker, more human, more painful. And perhaps that's why her final days remain among the most terrifying chapters in English royal history, because they remind us that no amount of ceremony, no legacy of conquest or culture, no myth of virginity or divine favor can protect the soul from itself. Elizabeth died as she lived, alone, misunderstood, surrounded by power, but untouched by comfort. Even now, centuries later, visitors to Westminster Abbey pass her tomb. And when the wind howls through old corridors and the candles flicker without warning, They say you can still hear the faint whisper of a queen who could not sleep, and never will. Let's have a look at the title. You've probably guessed it. It's going to be another Elizabeth special, all about the Virgin Queen. Okay, let's go. So the weeks following Elizabeth's burial were not marked by peace, but by a persistent disquiet that no proclamation from the new king could silence. The people of England had not simply lost a monarch, they had lost a symbol, a presence, a force that for nearly half a century had defined the rhythm of the realm. And in the void she left behind, rumors grew like mold on damp stone. Even among those who had never seen her in life, her absence was palpable. In marketplaces, in chapels, in alleyways, the same questions circled in low tones. Had she died well? Had she repented? Was she truly at rest? Those closest to her knew the answers were far more disturbing, for they had seen the mask slip. The image of Elizabeth, the eternal, crowned, poised, serene, had been a fragile illusion in her final weeks, barely held together by powder and performance. What remained beneath that veneer was not the mighty lioness of England, but a withered woman trembling in the dark, too afraid to close her eyes, too proud to show weakness, and too haunted to find sleep. She had spent her life mastering image, wielding symbolism like a weapon, and yet when the end came, none of it could shield her from the terrible intimacy of death. The courtiers who had once basked in her attention now spoke only in cautious tones about her final days. They rarely used her name, as though it might still summon her. In secret journals and coded letters, they hinted at what they had witnessed: the sleepless pacing, the vacant stares, the whispered names of the dead. Some feared that if these truths were made public, it would tarnish the very fabric of English glory. Others believed that by revealing her final decline, they could finally reclaim their own humanity from beneath the weight of her long shadow. But none could deny what they had seen. One servant confessed years later that he would often wake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, hearing her voice calling from behind closed doors, begging to be left alone, weeping like a child. Another claimed he had once passed her chamber and found her crouched in the corner, murmuring to a spot on the wall, tears streaking her white-painted face, her crown resting beside her on the floor like an abandoned relic. These stories passed from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation, became part of the oral folklore surrounding Gloriana's end. It wasn't just death that haunted the palace, it was the spectacle of a monarch losing control. And for a nation raised to believe in divine right, in majesty without flaw, this image was more terrifying than any battlefield or plague. It suggested that power could corrode from within, that the same force which had lifted her above others had slowly hollowed her out until only performance remained. And when even that failed her, what was left was not a queen, but a frightened woman in a darkened room. The priests who had been summoned to perform the final rites spoke of a kind of spiritual resistance. Elizabeth, they said, would not receive communion, would not utter the prayers, not allow the usual rituals of passage. Whether out of pride, fear, or confusion, she rejected the sacraments with the same stubbornness with which she had once rejected suitors and advisers. It was as though she intended to defy even God, or at least negotiate with him on her own terms. But to the clergy, this was not strength, it was spiritual peril. Some whispered that her soul was now restless, caught between this world and the next, neither damned nor saved, forever circling the place where her body had fallen. Meanwhile, James I settled into his throne with increasing discomfort. The shadow of Elizabeth loomed over every ceremony, every decree, every royal visit. He had inherited the crown, but not the reverence. Wherever he went, portraits of the Virgin Queen remained, their eyes seeming to judge him from the canvas, cold and eternal. He ordered some removed, replaced others with his own image, but the people did not forget. In fact, they clung to her memory more fiercely in her absence, casting her as the golden standard by which all others would be measured and found wanting. And so, Elizabeth's afterlife began not in heaven or hell, but in the collective psyche of a people who both revered and feared her. She became a kind of mythological creature, both divine and monstrous, a woman who had ruled with brilliance and brutality, who had loved no one and yet belonged to everyone, who had built an empire and died whispering to ghosts. Her story could not be tidied into a neat ending. It lingered, like the echo of footsteps down an empty hall. It bled through tapestries and court records, through paintings and plays, through the stones of the very palaces she once commanded. And in that lingering presence lay her truest power, not in the battles she won or the treaties she signed, but in the terror she left behind. The terror of a legacy that refused to fade. The terror of a woman who had become something more than human and something far more frightening. The year is 1603. Queen Elizabeth lies in the Palace of Whitehall, slowly dying. This is what history tells us. This is what her death may have sounded like. Time marched forward, but the air around Elizabeth's legacy never cleared. Even years after her body had turned to dust, the silence she left behind continued to speak in tremors, shaping the psychology of every monarch who came after. James I ruled with intellect, yes, but also with a quiet and constant anxiety. As if he feared that the moment he relaxed his grip, her ghost would return to reclaim what he had borrowed. In staterooms and private chambers, her name was spoken with caution. Her symbols, gloves, pearls, the Tudor rose were still visible. Carved into the architecture, woven into the cloth of banners, embedded in the ceremonial rituals of the crown, and yet no one dared speak of her death directly. It was a wound covered by velvet, a secret embalmed in stone. At Richmond Palace, where she had spent her last conscious days, servants still avoided the upper chambers. They claimed that on certain nights, especially in late March, the sound of pacing footsteps echoed above the ceiling beams. Long, slow, measured, as if someone were still refusing to rest. Doors that had been locked were found slightly ajar. Candles, freshly snuffed, would relight themselves with no breeze in the room. One maid reported seeing a woman in white staring out the window of the Queen's former chamber, her posture eerily still, her face lost to shadow. But when others investigated, the room was empty, except for the faint smell of lavender, Elizabeth's favorite perfume. And still her memory was not treated with tenderness. Yes, it was revered, but not with warmth. Not with comfort. Elizabeth was no saint. She had ordered executions with a flick of her hand. She had imprisoned her cousin Mary and signed her death warrant without flinching. She had used love as a weapon, trust as bait, and silence as a blade. Her courtiers never truly knew her. They loved her with terror. They obeyed her with devotion born not of affection, but awe. Even her most trusted advisers, Burleigh Walsingham, had learned to walk carefully in her presence, never sure which side of the Queen they would meet. In death, this caution persisted. No monument, no poem, no royal decree dared diminish her, because to do so felt dangerous, as if her very name still carried the power to curse. But while Elizabeth's death cast a long shadow over England's monarchy, it also seeded a darker truth in the collective soul of her people. The realization that glory was temporary and power could be beautiful and horrifying in the same breath. For the common folk, her reign had often felt distant. Her decisions made behind curtains of velvet and steel, yet in her decline she became strangely relatable, mortal, vulnerable, and in that there was a grim comfort if even Gloriana could fall. And perhaps suffering was not a punishment, but a condition shared by all. Writers and playwrights of the era began weaving her image into their work, sometimes in open tribute, other times as veiled commentary. Her downfall was used to explore the limits of power, the madness of isolation, the consequence of believing oneself chosen by divine right. And while the official chronicles praised her to the heavens, the underground stories told a more haunting tale. A queen who had ruled alone, loved no one, trusted few, and in the end died surrounded by people she could not reach. Some versions of the story became darker still. Whispers emerged that she had seen visions in her final hours, not of saints, but of the condemned. She cried out not for salvation, but for forgiveness from the shadows that crowded her chamber. That her last word was not a prayer, but a name, perhaps Essex, perhaps Dudley, perhaps someone unknown to history. That her ring, that sacred emblem of her marriage to the nation, had grown so loose on her finger that it fell off before burial. As though the union had finally dissolved. None of this could be confirmed, but none of it could be denied either. And so Elizabeth became a ghost of contradictions, a sovereign of strength and solitude, a woman whose greatest weapon had always been control, undone in the end by the one force she could not command. And this is perhaps what makes her death so terrifying, not the darkness of the room, not the silence of her courtiers, not the refusal to eat or sleep, but the realization that she saw it coming. That she knew, that for all her intelligence, her foresight, her ruthless calculation, she could not outwit the shadow waiting at the edge of her bed. And so she stood, for hours, for days, refusing to lay down. Not because she believed she could avoid death, but because standing was the only act of defiance left to her. And even now, in the quiet corners of English history, you can feel her presence.
Ow.
Not in the grandeur of her achievements, but in the quiet horror of her end. In the sound of a door closing softly, in the flicker of a candle in an empty room, in the cold stone beneath a royal tomb that still draws curious eyes and hushed voices. Elizabeth, I may have died centuries ago, but her final days, her final resistance, her final fear, continue to echo. The Elizabethan court had always revolved around her gravity. Every gesture, every silence, every smile or frown from the Queen could shift alliances, end careers, ignite scandals. But once she was gone, once the velvet cushions no longer bore her weight, the machinery she had held together with sheer will began to creak. But behind closed doors, in the moments between ceremony and sleep, the true memory haunted them. The memory of her pacing the cold floors, her lips cracked, eyes wide and distant. The days she spent standing, unwashed, whispering to no one, the way the palace smelled of decay and lavender. Her final moments had not been regal. They had been human. Painfully, disturbingly human. James I ordered no grand statues to be erected in her honor. Some said he feared her memory might overshadow his reign. Others believed he simply didn't understand what she had been to England. She had been more than monarch. She had been a presence, a phantom stitched into the very fabric of the nation. And now, with her gone, the court moved like a body missing its head, uncertain and cautious, fearing the empty air where her voice used to echo. Even the architecture seemed to remember her. The throne she once occupied felt colder somehow. The corridors she haunted grew quieter. Her bedchambers remained sealed for weeks, as if opening them too soon might let something unholy slip out. When they finally dared to enter, they found her belongings untouched. Gloves still laid upon the table. A mirror turned inward, as if it too could no longer bear to reflect the woman who once gazed into it. Her final garments, stained with sweat and age, were carefully catalogued, but no one dared dispose of them. They remained locked away, sacred and terrible, relics of a queen who had become something between saint and specter. Some servants refused to return to Richmond at all. One footman claimed he heard her voice humming through the rafters, the same lullaby she'd been known to murmur in the hours before dawn. Another said he'd seen a pale hand reach through the curtain in the chapel even though no one was inside. These stories were dismissed by the new court, but not forgotten. Because the truth, even when hidden beneath protocol and prayer, does not die with the body. It lingers, unsettled, just like the soul they feared had never found rest. In the countryside, commoners began to fashion charms bearing her initials. Believing that Elizabeth's spirit still had power to ward off evil, mothers whispered her name over their babies at night. Soldiers kept portraits of her in their packs. Her legend bled into magic, into folklore, into something both feared and revered. And yet even this reverence was laced with dread, because no one could shake the final image of a queen refusing comfort, staring into nothing, dragging her body toward a death she had foreseen but could not soften. Historians would argue for centuries about what truly happened in those final days. Was it madness? Was it guilt? Was it the unraveling of a life lived too long in isolation and control? Or had she seen something beyond the veil, something that pulled her from rest and sleep? Theories rose like smoke, thick and endless. But the one truth that no one could escape was this: Elizabeth did not die quietly. She did not go gently. Her death was not peaceful. It was a storm breaking within stone walls, a slow and terrifying surrender. And perhaps that is what makes her story endure, not the power, not the speeches, not the golden age that bore her name, but the image of a monarch facing her end without armor. Because in those final days, Elizabeth I became what she had never allowed herself to be in life: vulnerable, unprotected, alone. And yet, even then, she did not scream. She did not beg. She did not plead. She simply stood, stared, and waited. What she saw in those last hours, no one will ever know, whether it was the faces of the condemned or the ghosts of the lovers she had lost. Whether it was the reckoning of a soul burdened by too many secrets, or perhaps she saw nothing at all. Perhaps the terror was in the silence, in the realization that, after everything, she would pass like anyone else into darkness, unnamed, untouched. But the world did not forget, and the darkness she entered was not complete. For even now, in hushed tones, in stone halls, in the flickering corners of forgotten rooms, her story is still told, not in light, but in shadow. The court moved on, because it had to. James I held his coronation with measured pomp, the banners raised, the trumpets echoing through Westminster. But no ceremony could erase what the palace still remembered. Even in celebration, her shadow persisted, like a figure just beyond the curtain, watching silently as history bent itself into new shapes. The tapestries were replaced, the portraits rehung, but those who had stood in Elizabeth's presence knew that something vital had been lost, something no new monarch could replicate. James ruled, yes, but he did not haunt. And haunting, it seemed, had been Elizabeth's truest power. The fear she once instilled had transmuted. It became awe, then myth, then unease. Even after her burial, rumors flourished that her death had not been natural, that perhaps she had chosen to die at that precise moment as a final act of control, that perhaps she had willed her own end rather than allow the humiliation of weakness to persist one day longer. Some claimed she had summoned astrologers in her final nights, seeking a celestial time to vanish. Others believed her decline had been orchestrated by those who wanted her gone. Whispers of poison, of betrayal, of curses left unsaid. None of it could be proven. All of it lingered. But the most disturbing stories came from those who had attended her bedside, those few allowed to see the Queen without her mask. One maid confessed years later that Elizabeth had spoken to her as if she were someone else entirely, calling her by the name of a long-dead sister, gripping her wrist so tightly that bruises bloomed. A gentleman of the Privy Chamber reported that in her final hours, she stared past him, wide-eyed, and whispered, "He is here now." When asked who, she would not respond. Only silence, only stillness, and then the trembling. Whether these were hallucinations or true visitations, no one could say. But they became part of the legend, part of the legacy. For Elizabeth's story could never simply end. A light extinguished not softly but violently. A monarch dragged into the void by unseen hands. Whether metaphor or memory, those images stuck. They became truth. Because the truth was not in documents or records, it was in the fear etched on the faces of those who had been there, the dread they refused to name. And outside the palace, among the people, something strange happened. Elizabeth, once so distant, so untouchable, became familiar in her death. Folktales grew from the soil of her story. She was said to visit the dreams of widows, to protect young girls from assault, to punish cruel husbands. Her spirit, they claimed, had not left England, but now wandered it more freely, more powerfully than ever before. A queen in life, a force in death. In one small village, mothers began telling their daughters, "Be strong, like the dead queen." In another, it was said that a shrine had been built in secret, a place where women knelt to ask Elizabeth's blessing for courage or revenge. The church naturally condemned these practices, but they could not stop them. Because the people had seen something in her final days that no doctrine could explain. A monarch who faced the dark without armor, who embraced the terror others fled. And the monarchy, meanwhile, struggled to contain her legacy. James wanted peace, not phantoms. But peace was elusive when the past refused to stay buried. Elizabeth's funeral mask, made of wax, was stored away in a vault, but servants swore it wept. Her crown, passed on to the new king, was polished and reset with new gems, but still bore the weight of her touch. And every time James entered a hall where she had once ruled, there was a hush, a hesitation, as though the room remembered. Years turned to decades. Elizabeth became a chapter in history, but not a quiet one. Plays were written, portraits were commissioned. Her legend grew teeth, then wings. She was called the Virgin Queen, the Phoenix Queen, the Last Tudor, but behind every title, every flourish of praise, there lurked the same image of a woman alone, refusing sleep, whispering to shadows, staring into the void. And still, no one could quite explain her final words. If she uttered any at all, some claim she uttered a blessing, others, a warning. One account, half buried in a private letter, claimed she simply said, "I am not done," and then her eyes closed. No one knows if that account was true. But those 4 words, like a nail in old wood, refused to come loose. I am not done, not a farewell, not a prayer, but a statement, a promise. Or perhaps, who killed Queen Elizabeth I? For decades, the official story went like this. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, died of natural causes at the age of 69, having outlived most of her contemporaries and all of her siblings. Her passing was announced on March 1603. She had reigned for 44 years, longer than any previous monarch except for Queen Victoria. But who were the real causes of her death? What did the official story ignore? Let's take a look at the last days of the Virgin Queen. As Elizabeth neared her mortal end, her mind began to wander, sometimes drifting too far off lands, other times to childhood memories. She was also troubled by vermin and would complain about the fleas and flies about her. Or she would speak of her parents, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, whose unhappy fate had made her the improbable heir to the throne. She asked to have her father's old cap placed on her head and would pray. According to legend, a raven flew in through an open window, perched on her shoulder and croaked hoarsely before flying away. Some say the bird was a bad omen. Others say it was just a raven. On March, her doctors were concerned about her failing health. She suffered from dizziness, had difficulty speaking, and seemed confused. As she lay in her bed at Richmond Palace, she was visited by her secretary, Sir Robert Carey, who tried to distract her from her morbid thoughts. He read aloud from one of her favorite books, The Spanish Tragedy. But as he did, her breathing grew more shallow. Carey would later write, "Her looks were composed, her face somewhat wan. But she smiled upon me with a sweet countenance." As the night dragged on, Elizabeth continued to drift in and out of consciousness. At around 2 a.m., she sat up in bed and asked for a light to be brought near her, so that she could see the faces of those gathered around her. She recognized her attendants, some of whom had been with her for over 30 years. And to each, she expressed her gratitude for their service. Finally, she asked them to leave so that she could die in peace. Carey would later write that he thought this was the end. He left the room to go make ready for the next day. When he returned, Elizabeth was lying peacefully in her bed. Her breathing was shallow, but even Carey went to help her up. But she was too weak. She said, "'Tis well. Good night. The damn law, good night, I have done." Then she breathed a long time, turned herself to the left side and said, "I am not well," and slept. She was dead. Elizabeth I had been many things during her lifetime: politician, warrior, poet, enigma. She had ruled as a woman in a man's world, never marrying, never yielding, never stepping aside. But in her last days, stripped of power and voice, she had become something even more frightening: a mirror, a reminder that all the majesty in the world cannot hold back the dark. She had become a reflection of our deepest fears: aging, solitude, irrelevance, of watching the world we've built continue without us, knowing that the stories we told about ourselves might outlive us, but never protect us, standing alone in a palace filled with ghosts, and knowing that none will follow us into the grave. In the centuries since her death, historians have debated every detail of her passing. Did she really refuse food and light? Was her mind as sharp as her doctors believed? How many people witnessed her final moments? But all of the cold facts in the world cannot strip the narrative of its fear. Because Elizabeth left behind not just an empire, not just a legacy, a question. A quiet, creeping, terrifying question that lingers in the corridors of royal history like a whisper behind a locked door. What happens when someone who ruled with myth dies with nothing but silence? Her tomb in Westminster Abbey is grand, yes, carved in marble and Latin and gold. She rests beside her sister Mary, whom she once imprisoned. The irony is thick, nearly absurd. Two sisters who tore England apart, now forever inches from each other in death. But the silence of the tomb betrays nothing of what came before. The grief, the resistance, The fear that played out in those final days does not echo beneath the stone. Only the living carry it, only the stories. Only the eyes of those who walk past her monument and shiver, though the air is still.